You wake to the sound of bells cutting through the frozen darkness like a blade through flesh. Your breath crystallizes in the air, visible even in the dim moonlight filtering through the narrow window of the dormitory. You are 7 years old, and your small hands tremble as you reach for the rough woolen habit folded at the foot of your straw pallet. The stone floor beneath your bare feet has long since stopped feeling cold, or perhaps you've simply stopped feeling. Around you, shadows move in perfect silence. 20 other girls, some younger than you, rise like ghosts in the pre-dawn darkness. One child, barely 5 years old, struggles with her robes, her fingers too numb to work the ties. You want to help her, but you remember what happened to Margaret last week when she whispered comfort to a crying child. 3 days kneeling on scattered peas. 3 days without food. 3 days until her knees bled through her stockings and the abbess finally declared her spirit sufficiently broken. Before we descend deeper into these forgotten stone corridors, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. It genuinely amazes me that we're connected across continents by our curiosity about lives lived centuries ago in places most of us will never see. This is Whitby Abbey in Yorkshire, England. The year is 1247, during the reign of Henry III, when England's monasteries and convents functioned as political instruments disguised as sanctuaries. The girl trembling in the darkness is Lady Eleanor of Pembroke, daughter of a minor nobleman who needed to secure an alliance with the church more than he needed to keep his youngest daughter. She arrived 6 months ago, carried through those massive oak doors while her mother wept in the courtyard below. The doors closed. Her childhood ended. She would never see her family again. Never run through summer fields or taste honey cakes or feel the warmth of a hearth fire surrounded by people who knew her name with affection rather than authority. The archives at Whitby Abbey, now preserved in the British Library, contain meticulous records of daily life within these walls. What they reveal is not education, not spiritual awakening, not the peaceful contemplation we imagine when we picture medieval convents. They reveal systematic destruction, the methodical breaking of children's spirits in the name of salvation. How did places meant to serve God become prisons for the innocent? How did suffering become mistaken for holiness? And why did the families who claimed to love these children willingly condemn them to this fate? Dawn breaks with brutal inevitability. The first bell rings at 4 a.m, calling the children to matins. There is no gentle waking here, no mother's hand smoothing hair away from a sleepy face. The dormitory mistress, Sister Agatha, moves through the rows of pallets with a willow switch, striking any child who moves too slowly. The switch leaves red welts that fade by evening, convenient evidence that disappears before any visiting bishop might notice. Eleanor has learned to move quickly. She learned that lesson her first week when the switch caught her across the back of her legs, and she discovered that crying only brought additional punishment. Now she moves like water, fluid and silent, drawing no attention to herself. Invisibility is survival. The chapel is colder than the dormitory, if such a thing is possible. The children file in and kneel on bare stone, their thin robes providing no cushion against the brutal hardness. They will kneel here for 2 hours, reciting prayers in Latin that most of them don't understand. Eleanor's knees have developed permanent calluses, thick patches of roughened skin that her mother would have been horrified to see. But her mother is a memory that grows dimmer each day, a face that Eleanor tries desperately to hold in her mind even as it fades like morning mist. At Shaftesbury Abbey in Dorset, founded in 888 A.D., the chronicler Abbess Ælfgifu kept detailed records that paint an even grimmer picture. In 1043, Lady Giva of Mercia sent her 4-year-old daughter Edith to the abbey to secure a political alliance. Ælfgifu wrote in her careful Latin script, "Parvula Edith weeps without cease for 3 days and nights. Her tears freeze upon her cheeks in the morning cold. She calls for her mother in the Saxon tongue, but we speak only Latin here. She must learn that her mother is dead to her now, and God is her only father. 4 years old." Imagine a child of 4, torn from everything she knows, placed among strangers who speak a foreign language, forbidden to cry for her mother without being beaten. The archives don't record how long Edith wept. They don't tell us when she finally stopped calling for her mother. They don't document the moment when something inside her broke and she learned to exist rather than live. But we can read between the lines. 6 months after Edith's arrival, Elfgifu notes with satisfaction, the child has achieved proper submission. She no longer weeps or speaks of worldly attachments. She is learning to love God above all earthly things. This was not spiritual development. This was psychological annihilation. Food was not nourishment in these places. It was a weapon of control. The children at Wilton Abbey in Wiltshire ate once, sometimes twice daily. Breakfast consisted of a small piece of black bread and a cup of water. Dinner was thin barley porridge with perhaps a few vegetables if the Abbey garden had produced well that season. Meat was forbidden except on the highest feast days, and even then it appeared in quantities so small that the children learned to make each bite last as long as possible, rolling the rare morsel of chicken or fish around in their mouths until it dissolved. Sister Matilda, the Abbey's chronicler in 1245, wrote with disturbing clinical detachment, "Little Constance suffers from a fever that burns her flesh and makes her speak in strange tongues. We have bled her thrice and given her bitter herbs, but she grows weaker. The abbess says it is God's will, that perhaps her suffering will purchase grace for us all." Constance was 8 years old. Modern physicians would recognize her symptoms as severe malnutrition complicated by infection. Medieval nuns saw it as divine will and let her die while they praised God for her sacrifice. But hunger did something else to these children. It consumed their thoughts, invaded their dreams, became an obsession that crowded out everything else. Agnes of Bohemia, daughter of King Ottokar I, was sent to the Poor Clare's convent in Prague in 1234 at age 8. Her confessor, Brother Francis, wrote to her father with barely concealed frustration, "Your daughter speaks of nothing but food. She counts the hours between meals. She weeps not for your absence, but for the memory of roasted fowl and honeyed wine. This is not devotion, Your Majesty. This is desperation. How can a child focus on God when her stomach consumes itself? How can she concentrate on prayer when every thought is dominated by fantasies of bread, of meat, of anything that might fill the hollow ache inside her?" The abbesses called it spiritual discipline. We might call it torture. Eleanor of Pembroke learned to hoard. She discovered that a piece of bread tucked into her sleeve, saved from breakfast and eaten slowly during the long hours of afternoon prayers, could make the difference between manageable hunger and the kind of gnawing emptiness that made her dizzy during evening services. She wasn't alone. Archaeological excavations at several medieval convents have uncovered hidden caches, small holes in walls where children concealed scraps of food, pieces of bread so old they had turned to stone, testament to desperation that lasted centuries. Winter transformed these stone fortresses into chambers of exquisite suffering. At Nunminster Abbey in Winchester, built in 902 AD, the dormitory was a long, narrow hall with a single small fireplace at one end. The children slept 3 or 4 to a narrow straw mattress, huddled together for warmth that never quite came. They slept fully clothed, wearing every piece of clothing they owned, and still woke with frostbite on their fingers and toes. Lady Isabel de Clare, sent to Amesbury Abbey in Wiltshire in 1248 at age 6, wrote decades later in her memoir, "I remember the sound of teeth chattering in the darkness like castanets played by invisible hands. I remember the girl next to me, Marie, who was barely 5 and came from Normandy. She spoke no English and wept every night for her nurse. One morning in February she would not wake. Her lips were blue as violets. They carried her away while we recited morning prayers, and we never spoke of her again. It was as if she had never existed." Marie's death appears in the Abbey records as a single line. "One child died of cold, February 1249. No name, No family notification. No investigation into why a 5-year-old froze to death in a wealthy abbey that collected enormous dowries from noble families. She was buried in an unmarked grave in the convent cemetery, one among dozens of children who simply didn't survive their forced vocation. The death rate was staggering. At Shaftesbury Abbey, the death roll for 1209 shows typical entries. Johanna, age 5, died of fever. Marguerite, age 7, died of wasting sickness. Beatrice, age 6, died of consumption. Nearly 30% of children admitted to convents died before age 10. Modern historians examining these records have concluded what should be obvious. These children were dying from malnutrition, exposure, disease, and despair. The conditions in these supposedly holy places were killing them. But perhaps physical death was not the worst fate. Perhaps worse was what happened to the children who survived. Eleanor watched Marie die. She watched Beatrice waste away from some unnamed illness. She watched Constance burn with fever until the life left her eyes. And with each death, something inside Eleanor hardened. She learned not to form attachments. She learned not to care. She learned that survival required becoming something less than human, a creature of pure obedience, stripped of emotion, moving through each day like a clockwork automaton wound up by bells and set in motion by fear. The psychological techniques used to break these children were sophisticated and deliberate. At Barking Abbey in Essex, the silence rule was absolute. From morning prayers until the final bell at night, speaking was forbidden unless specifically required for lessons or confession. Children learned to communicate through glances, through subtle hand positions during prayer, through the careful placement of their bodies in the refectory. A tilted head might mean hunger. A certain way of holding the prayer book could signal illness. A particular posture during Mass might indicate that someone was drowning in despair. Sister Maynard, who served as disciplinarian at Barking from 1203 to 1219, kept meticulous records in her Liber Correctionis, her Book of Corrections. Her entries read like a catalogue of cruelty. Alicia, age 7, struck 5 times with the rod for laughing during none. Marguerite, age 9, 15 strokes for speaking during the reading of Scripture. Beatrice, age 5, held by the arms while struck 10 times for wetting her bedding. 5 years old. Beaten for wetting her bed. Held by other nuns while Sister Maynard brought the rod down on her small body again and again. What lesson was this teaching except that adults cannot be trusted, that authority means cruelty, that God, if he existed, had abandoned her completely? Eleanor of Aquitaine's youngest daughter, Joanna, spent 3 years at Fontevraud Abbey in France beginning in 1176. Her letters to her mother, discovered in the Abbey archives in the 19th century, reveal a child slowly fragmenting under the weight of constant surveillance and punishment. Dearest Mother, I have learned to move like a shadow and breathe like a whisper. Yesterday, I was beaten for allowing my thoughts to wander during matins. How do they know what I think? I fear they can see inside my mind. I fear they can see my dreams of home. How do you break a child's spirit so completely that she fears even her own thoughts? You surround her with adults who claim omniscience. You punish her for infractions she doesn't understand. You create an environment where safety is impossible, where perfection is demanded but never defined, where the rules shift and change based on the mood of the abbess. You teach her that she is fundamentally corrupt, that her natural impulses are sinful, that her only hope lies in complete surrender of self. At Romsey Abbey in Hampshire, Dame Clemence instituted a policy she called spiritual detachment. Girls were forbidden from speaking of their families or their lives before entering the convent. The past is death, she proclaimed. Only the present service to God matters. Those who dwell on earthly affections will find no peace in prayer. Children who mentioned their parents or siblings were locked in solitary confinement, fed only bread and water until they agreed to release their worldly attachments. Young Lady Maud de Breos, sent to Aikenbury Priory in Herefordshire in 1235 at age 7, kept a secret diary in coded script. I try to remember my mother's face, but it grows dimmer each day. Sister Agatha says this is good, that I am learning to love God more than earthly things. But I do not feel love for God. I feel only emptiness, as if something precious has been carved out of my chest with a dull knife. I pretend to be holy, but inside I am becoming hollow. Hollow. That word appears again and again in the documents that survive. Letters smuggled out, diaries hidden in walls, confessions recorded by troubled priests. These children were not being educated or enlightened. They were being systematically emptied, their personalities erased, their spirits crushed, until nothing remained but obedient shells who moved through religious rituals with perfect precision and zero comprehension. The irony is devastating. Most of these children came from wealthy, powerful families who could have provided them with excellent educations, comfortable lives, meaningful futures. Lady Eleanor de Montfort, daughter of Simon de Montfort, was sent to Amesbury Abbey in 1265 at age 8 following her father's death in battle. She wrote to her mother, "I had everything a child could want: books, music, fine clothes, loving servants. Now I have nothing but cold stones and endless prayers. They tell me I am blessed, that I am closer to God than those who live in the world. But I feel farther from heaven than ever. For how can a God of love create such misery for his smallest children?" Some children resisted. At Godstow Abbey, a girl named Mabel of Gloucester attempted escape in 1278 by hiding in a cart carrying supplies to Oxford. She was discovered and brought back, then locked in the Abbey's underground punishment cell for 3 months. The cell was barely large enough for a child to lie down, with no light and minimal food. When she was finally released, the other children reported that she had lost the ability to speak coherently. She would rock back and forth, humming tunelessly, her eyes fixed on nothing. Dame Alice of Normandy, who served as abbess at Malling Abbey in Kent from 1289 to 1305, kept a journal documenting escape attempts. Young Marie attempted to scale the walls during matins. She fell and broke her arm, which I take as God's punishment for her defiance. Catherine tried to hide in the hay wagons bound for Canterbury. Isabel feigned illness. All these attempts reveal the same evil, the unwillingness to submit to God's plan for their lives. God's plan. How convenient that God's plan always seemed to align with political expediency and ecclesiastical profit. The economic aspect of these arrangements cannot be ignored. At Shaftesbury Abbey, the account books for 1267 show the abbey collected over 2,000 marks in dowries for accepting noble daughters, a sum equivalent to millions in modern currency. These convents were profitable enterprises built on the suffering of children whose families paid handsomely to be rid of surplus daughters. Dame Juliana, who served as abbess at Carrow Abbey from 1342 to 1359, wrote with startling frankness, "The noble families pay handsomely to be rid of their surplus daughters. We provide them with a holy justification for what is essentially abandonment. The children suffer, but the coffers are full and the church grows stronger. I sometimes wonder if God approves of this exchange of innocence for gold." But some children, despite everything, found ways to preserve fragments of their humanity. During excavations at Shaftesbury Abbey in the 1960s, archaeologists discovered a cache of objects hidden in the dormitory wall: a wooden doll, a piece of colored glass, a pressed flower, and a letter written in a childish hand. The letter, in Norman French, reads, "My name is Eleanor. I am 7 years old. I have been here for 2 years. I remember my mother's voice when she sang to me. I remember my father's beard against my cheek. I remember my dog, Roos, who would sleep at the foot of my bed. I write this so that someone will know I was here, that I was real, that I was loved." Eleanor's hidden letter survived 7 centuries, longer than the Abbey itself, longer than the system that imprisoned her. She wanted someone to know she existed, not as a statistic in an account book, but as a child with a name and a dog and a father whose beard tickled her cheek. In hiding that letter and preserving those small treasures, she resisted the erasure that the Abbey demanded. She insisted on her humanity, even as everyone around her worked to destroy it.